More than 26 years after a 19-year-old college student vanished into the California night, a jury finally declared her killer guilty. The shocking part, investigators never found her body. No crime scene was ever conclusively recovered. No confession was ever obtained. Yet prosecutors convinced a jury that Kristin Smart had been murdered. For decades, one man lived under a cloud of suspicion. Students whispered his name on campus. Detectives repeatedly returned to him. Kristin's family spent years watching leads appear and disappear, wondering whether they would ever learn what happened to their daughter. Then, after more than 2 decades of silence, investigators uncovered evidence that changed everything. What they found suggested a secret had been hidden for years, possibly beneath a family home. It was a discovery that reignited one of America's most infamous cold cases and set the stage for a courtroom battle many believed would never happen. A battle where the prosecution had to prove murder without a body, without a confession, and nearly 3 decades after Kristin was last seen alive. But before the headlines, before the arrests, and before a California courtroom heard the evidence that would captivate the nation, there was simply a young woman finishing her freshman year of college. She was excited for summer break. Her family expected her home within days. Instead, Memorial Day weekend of 1996 became the beginning of a mystery that would haunt California for a generation. This is the story of Kristin Smart, the girl who left a party, never made it back to her dorm room, and whose disappearance became one of the most relentless searches for justice in modern American history. Before we dive deeper into the story of Kristin Smart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Every subscription helps us continue producing in-depth crime documentaries like this one. Stories that not only seek answers for victims and their families, but also raise awareness about the circumstances surrounding these crimes. Your support helps this channel grow and continue its mission of using knowledge, awareness, and education as tools in the fight against crime. Now, let's get to the details of Kristin Smart's story. Imagine being a parent and receiving a phone call that changes your life forever. Not because of what happened, but because nobody can tell you what happened. No accident, no witness, no answers, just a daughter who vanished into the night, and a mystery that would haunt California for more than a quarter of a century. For 26 years, investigators chased fragments of evidence. Rumors spread, witnesses came forward, search teams combed through properties, cadaver dogs alerted, ground-penetrating radar uncovered disturbing clues. Yet one question remained stubbornly unanswered. Where is Kristin Smart? Today, we're examining one of the most infamous cold cases in American history. A case involving a college freshman, a late-night walk back to campus, and a suspect who drew investigators' attention almost immediately. For decades, there was no body, no murder weapon, no confession, and no arrest. Yet many believed they knew exactly who was responsible. The mystery became so enduring that generations of Californians grew up hearing Kristin's name. Parents warned their children about the case. Students arriving at college campuses heard whispers of the young woman who disappeared after a party and never returned. And her family? They refused to stop searching. While years turned into decades, Kristin's loved ones continued waking up every morning with the same painful uncertainty. Because as long as there was no body, there was always the possibility, however small, that answers might still be waiting somewhere. But behind every headline, every search warrant, and every courtroom battle was a real person, a daughter, a sister, a friend, a teenager with dreams for her future. Before Kristin Smart became the face of one of America's longest-running cold cases, she was simply a young woman beginning the next chapter of her life. Born on February 20th, 1977, Kristin Denise Smart grew up in Stockton, California. Friends remembered her as outgoing, energetic, and compassionate. She possessed the kind of personality that naturally filled a room, the kind of person who made friends easily, the kind of daughter who was treasured at home by her family, a young woman whose future seemed limitless. Like many teenagers preparing for adulthood, Kristin was excited about what lay ahead. College represented freedom, new experiences, new friendships, and the opportunity to build a career doing something she loved. By 1996, she had enrolled at California Polytechnic State University, better known as Cal Poly, in San Luis Obispo. For Kristin, it was the beginning of a dream. She was studying architecture and completing her freshman year. The transition to college life appeared to be going exactly as planned. She was making friends, exploring campus, creating memories, and preparing for a summer break that was only days away. Back home, her parents, Stan and Denise Smart, looked forward to seeing their daughter return after finishing the school year. Nothing about those final weeks suggested that a tragedy was quietly approaching. Nothing suggested that one ordinary holiday weekend would eventually become the center of a nationwide investigation. But sometimes the most devastating stories begin on days that seem completely ordinary. And on Memorial Day weekend of 1996, Kristin Smart had no idea she was about to step into the final chapter of her known life. The events that followed would leave behind a trail of questions, suspicion, and heartbreak that would endure for decades. And at the center of it all was a late-night party, a walk back to campus, and the last person known to have seen Kristin Smart alive. Memorial Day weekend had arrived. For students at Cal Poly, it marked the unofficial beginning of summer. Final exams were winding down. Many students were preparing to head home. Others were taking advantage of one last weekend with friends before campus life slowed for the season. The atmosphere was relaxed, carefree, the kind of weekend college students remember for years. On the evening of Friday, May 24, 1996, Kristin Smart joined friends and fellow students for a party near campus. At first, nothing about the night seemed unusual. Music played, students gathered in groups, conversations flowed from one corner of the party to another. Like countless college gatherings across America, it was a place where young people came together to celebrate the end of another school year. Somewhere in that crowd was a fellow freshman named Paul Flores. At the time, he was simply another student. Nobody could have imagined that his name would one day become permanently linked to one of California's most notorious criminal investigations. As the evening progressed, witnesses later recalled that Kristin appeared increasingly impaired. Accounts varied regarding the exact details of the night, but multiple individuals remembered seeing her struggling physically as the party continued. Eventually, the gathering began to wind down. Students started leaving in small groups. Some headed back to campus. Others made arrangements with friends. Meanwhile, Kristin was having difficulty making her way on her own. Sometime after 2 a.m., Maird's empty point, she was discovered lying on a lawn near the party location. Concerned students stopped to help. One of them was a student named Cheryl Anderson. Another was Tim Davis. Together, they attempted to assist Kristin back toward the dormitory area. Paul Flores also joined the group. At that moment, nobody viewed the situation as unusual. A group of college students helping a fellow student get home safely. It was the kind of thing people do every day. As they walked through the darkness toward campus, Kristin struggled to keep pace. The journey was slow. Several times, the group had to stop. Witnesses later described her as having difficulty walking on her own. Yet despite the challenges, they continued moving toward the residence halls. Eventually, the group reached a point where their paths would separate. Tim Davis headed toward his own dormitory. Cheryl Anderson also prepared to leave. That left Kristin and Paul Flores. According to witness accounts, Flores stated that his dormitory was nearby and that he would make sure Kristin got back safely. From the perspective of the others, the situation appeared reasonable. A fellow student was offering assistance. There was no obvious sign of danger, no visible reason to suspect that something was wrong. So they continued on their way, and Kristin continued hers, with Paul Flores. What happened next remains one of the most heavily scrutinized periods in modern true crime history, because after that moment, the trail begins to disappear. One witness later reported seeing Kristin and Flores walking near the dormitory area. According to that account, Kristin appeared to be heading in the direction of her residence hall, but she never arrived. The next morning, there were no reports of Kristin returning to her room. No confirmed sightings, no phone calls home, no messages to friends, nothing. At first, the absence did not immediately trigger alarm. College students sometimes stayed with friends, changed plans, traveled unexpectedly, missed obligations. But as hours turned into days, concern began growing among those who knew her. Friends noticed something wasn't right. Family members became worried. And soon, a terrifying possibility began to emerge. Kristin Smart had vanished. Not only had she disappeared after being seen with the same person investigators would spend decades trying to understand. As concerns spread across campus, students began retracing the events of that final night. Who saw Kristin? Who spoke to her? who walked with her, and most importantly, who was the last person to see her alive? The answer to that question would place Paul Flores under a microscope that he would never escape, because while Kristin's trail had gone cold, suspicion was only beginning to heat up. And in the days ahead, investigators would discover a series of details that many found impossible to ignore. Some of those details would raise eyebrows, others would raise serious questions, and together they would form the foundation of a case that would remain unsolved for more than 26 years. By the morning of May 25, 1996, Kristin Smart was gone. At first, her absence didn't immediately trigger panic. College campuses are busy places. Students often change plans, spend nights with friends, or leave town without informing everyone around them. But as the holiday weekend continued, something felt different. Kristin wasn't answering messages. She wasn't showing up where friends expected to see her, and perhaps most concerning of all, she wasn't behaving like herself. Those closest to her knew something was wrong. Days passed, then more days. The silence became impossible to explain. When Kristin failed to return home as expected, her family's concern quickly escalated into fear. Her parents began making calls, trying to piece together her last known movements. Every conversation seemed to lead back to the same night, the same party, the same walk back to campus, and the same final companion, Paul Flores. As investigators began interviewing students, a timeline slowly emerged. Witnesses consistently placed Flores with Kristin during the final known hours before her disappearance. That fact alone didn't make him guilty of anything. But it did make him important, very important. In any missing person investigation, detectives focus intensely on the last confirmed contacts. And in Kristin's case, Flores stood at the center of that timeline. The more investigators looked, the more questions surfaced. One detail, in particular, immediately caught attention. Shortly after Kristin disappeared, Flores appeared with a noticeable black eye. Naturally, investigators wanted to know how it happened. The answers they received were inconsistent. Over time, different explanations reportedly emerged. And while having an injury doesn't prove involvement in a crime, conflicting explanations often attract scrutiny during an investigation. Detectives took note, so did fellow students. As word spread across campus, rumors began circulating. Students talked in dormitories. They discussed the case in classrooms. They exchanged theories about what might have happened. And increasingly, one name kept coming up, Paul Flores. Yet despite the growing suspicion, investigators faced a major problem. Suspicion is not evidence. Questions are not proof. And law enforcement still lacked the crucial piece needed to move the case forward. They had no body, no crime scene, no direct eyewitness to a crime, no confession. The investigation continued anyway. Search teams combed through areas surrounding the campus. Volunteers joined efforts to locate Kristin. Flyers appeared, news coverage expanded. The Smart family refused to give up. Neither did many members of the community. Still, every search seemed to end the same way, without answers. As weeks turned into months, detectives continued examining Flores' movements before and after Kristin vanished. They reviewed witness statements. They revisited timelines. They looked for inconsistencies, but the case remained frustratingly out of reach. For Kristin's parents, the uncertainty was devastating. Every day brought new possibilities. Perhaps she would be found. Perhaps someone would come forward. Perhaps a missing piece of evidence would suddenly emerge. But none of those things happened. Instead, the investigation entered a phase familiar to many families of missing persons. The waiting, the wondering, the not knowing. Years began to pass. New students arrived at Cal Poly, many unaware that an active mystery still hovered over the campus. But Kristin's family never stopped pushing for answers, and investigators never completely stopped looking. The case remained open, the questions remained unanswered, and the person many believed held the key to those answers continued living under a cloud of suspicion. Then came another challenge: time. Because with every passing year, memories faded, witnesses moved away, evidence became harder to locate, and what had begun as a missing person investigation was gradually transforming into something else, a cold case. For many investigations, that would have been the end. A file placed on a shelf, an unsolved mystery destined to remain unanswered. But Kristin Smart's case was different. The story refused to disappear. Journalists continued asking questions. Investigators continued receiving tips. Members of the public continued discussing the case. And deep inside law enforcement, some detectives remained convinced that the truth was still out there. What they didn't know was that years later, new technology, renewed public interest, and a determined, independent voice would breathe new life into the investigation. The case that many feared would never be solved was about to enter a dramatic new chapter. A chapter that would eventually lead investigators back to the same suspect they had been examining since the very beginning. And this time, they would be armed with evidence they had never had before. By the early 2000s, a painful reality had settled over the Smart family. Years had passed since Kristin disappeared. Searches had come and gone. Tips had been investigated. Leads had been exhausted. And still, there was no sign of their daughter. In 2002, after 6 years without any confirmed contact or verified sightings, Kristin Smart was declared legally dead. It was a legal milestone, but emotionally, it changed nothing. Her family still had no answers, no recovery, no explanation, no place to visit and say goodbye. For many cold cases, this is the point where public attention begins to fade. News coverage slows, witnesses move on, communities heal and forget. But Kristin's case was different. It lingered. Every few years, a new tip would emerge. Investigators would conduct another search. A fresh headline would reignite public interest. Then the case would grow quiet again, only to resurface once more. It was as if the mystery refused to stay buried. And perhaps that was because so many people believed the truth was still within reach. Behind the scenes, detectives continued working. The investigation never truly closed. The file remained active. Evidence was reviewed. Witnesses were re-interviewed. New forensic techniques became available. Yet despite decades of effort, the breakthrough everyone hoped for remained elusive. Then, more than 20 years after Kristin vanished, something unexpected happened. The case found a new audience, not through television, not through a major newspaper, but through a podcast. In 2019, a local musician named Chris Lambert launched a podcast called Your Own Backyard. What began as a personal effort to revisit a local mystery quickly evolved into something much larger. Lambert meticulously examined the case. He interviewed witnesses, he reconstructed timelines, he highlighted details that many people had forgotten. Most importantly, he introduced Kristin's story to an entirely new generation. The response was extraordinary. Listeners across the country became invested in the case. Many heard details they had never known before. Others who had information began reaching out. Former students revisited memories they hadn't thought about in years. People who once stayed silent started talking. And investigators were listening. Law enforcement later acknowledged that renewed public interest generated valuable leads. For the first time in years, momentum was building. The case was moving. Then came a series of developments that would dramatically increase pressure on the investigation. Authorities began conducting additional searches connected to the Flores family. Search warrants were executed. Properties were examined. Investigators brought in specialized resources designed to detect evidence that might have been missed decades earlier. Among the tools used were cadaver dogs and advanced forensic techniques. As investigators expanded their efforts, attention increasingly focused on a property associated with Paul Flores' father, Ruben Flores. For years, rumors had circulated regarding the location. Now, investigators were looking much closer. During one of the searches, forensic specialists identified an area beneath a deck structure that immediately drew interest. Ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies in the soil. Further examination suggested the area had been disturbed in a manner consistent with a burial site. Then came another significant finding. Forensic testing indicated evidence consistent with human decomposition having occurred in that location. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. For decades, investigators had struggled to establish where Kristin might have been taken. Now they appeared to have found evidence suggesting her remains had once been present beneath the property. But there was a heartbreaking complication. The evidence also suggested that whatever had been there was no longer there. Investigators increasingly believed the remains had been moved. The discovery offered both hope and frustration. Hope because it appeared to support long-standing suspicions. Frustration because Kristin herself was still missing. Even so, the significance of the findings could not be ignored. After years of speculation, investigators finally possessed evidence they believed strengthened their theory of the case. And they weren't finished. Additional searches followed. More evidence was collected. Detectives continued assembling pieces of a puzzle that had remained incomplete for over 2 decades. Then, in April of 2021, the announcement many thought might never come finally arrived. After nearly 25 years of investigation, there would be arrests. For the Smart family, it was a moment they had waited almost half their lives to see. The suspect, who had remained under scrutiny since 1996, was now being formally charged. But securing an arrest was only the beginning. Because what came next would be one of the most challenging prosecutions in modern California history. Prosecutors were preparing to do something few legal teams ever attempt. They were going to try a murder case without a body, without a confirmed crime scene, and without knowing exactly where the victim's remains were located. Everything would now come down to one question. Could they convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt? After 26 years, the search for answers was finally heading into a courtroom. On April 13, 2021, nearly 25 years after Kristin Smart disappeared, investigators made the announcement that many people had long wondered if they would ever hear. Paul Flores was under arrest. For Kristin's family, it was a moment filled with emotion, relief, disbelief, hope, and perhaps a measure of vindication. For decades, they had fought to keep Kristin's story alive. Now, the criminal justice system was finally taking its most significant step, but Paul Flores was not the only person taken into custody. His father, Ruben Flores, was also arrested. Prosecutors alleged that after Kristin's death, Ruben had helped conceal evidence connected to the crime. The arrests immediately drew national attention. News organizations across the country revisited the case. Legal analysts weighed in, and one question dominated the conversation. How do you prove murder when the victim's body has never been found? That challenge would define everything that followed. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors outlined their theory. They argued that Kristin Smart never made it safely home after leaving the party. According to the prosecution, Paul Flores separated from the other students and took advantage of a vulnerable situation. They alleged that Kristin was killed during the commission of a serious crime and that efforts were later made to conceal what had happened. The defense saw things very differently. Attorneys for Paul Flores argued that the prosecution's case was built largely on assumptions and circumstantial evidence. They emphasized a point that would be repeated throughout the trial. No body had ever been recovered. No direct physical evidence conclusively established how Kristin died, and no witness testified to seeing a murder take place. The defense maintained that suspicion alone could not support a conviction. The courtroom battle that followed would become one of the most closely watched trials in California. Over weeks of testimony, jurors heard from investigators, forensic specialists, former students, and numerous witnesses connected to the case. Many of the events discussed had occurred more than 2 decades earlier. Yet prosecutors sought to demonstrate that the evidence, when viewed together, pointed consistently in one direction. One of the most significant aspects of the trial involved forensic findings connected to the Flores family property. Experts testified regarding soil disturbances and evidence that investigators believed was consistent with a clandestine burial site. Jurors heard about testing that suggested human decomposition had occurred beneath a deck structure on the property. The prosecution argued that these findings supported their theory that Kristin's remains had once been buried there before being moved. The defense challenged those conclusions. They questioned the reliability of certain interpretations and argued that the evidence did not definitively establish Kristin's presence. As the trial progressed, jurors were repeatedly reminded of a central legal principle: circumstantial evidence is still evidence. Under American law, a conviction can be based on circumstantial evidence if jurors conclude that the evidence proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution's strategy relied heavily on that principle. Rather than presenting a single dramatic piece of evidence, prosecutors assembled a mosaic: witness testimony, behavioral evidence, timeline reconstruction, forensic findings, statements made over the years, and the fact that Paul Flores was the last known person seen with Kristin. Piece by piece, they asked jurors to consider the totality of the evidence. Meanwhile, the defense worked to create reasonable doubt. They argued that the investigation had stretched across decades. Memories could fade, witness accounts could change, and assumptions could become mistaken for facts. It was a strategy aimed at highlighting uncertainty. After all, uncertainty is often the defense's strongest ally in a criminal trial. As testimony continued, the emotional weight of the case became increasingly apparent. For Kristin's family, every court session represented another painful reminder of the daughter they had lost. For jurors, the responsibility was enormous. They were being asked to decide a case that had haunted California for more than 26 years. And they had to do so based solely on the evidence presented in court, not public opinion, not media coverage, not decades of speculation, only evidence. Eventually, after months of proceedings, closing arguments arrived. The prosecution argued that the evidence revealed a clear and compelling narrative. A young woman disappeared. One person was last seen with her, and the evidence pointed to that same individual again and again over the course of 26 years. The defense urged jurors to focus on what remained unknown. No body, no direct witness, no definitive account of exactly what happened. Then the case was placed in the hands of the jury. For Kristin's family, another agonizing wait began. For Paul Flores and Ruben Flores, everything now depended on 12 strangers. And for the jury, one question remained. Had the prosecution proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt? After more than a quarter-century of uncertainty, the answer was finally about to arrive. On October 18, 2022, the courtroom fell silent. For more than 26 years, Kristin Smart's family had lived with uncertainty. They had endured false hopes, dead ends, rumors, and countless days wondering whether they would ever learn the truth about what happened to their daughter. Now, the moment they had waited decades for had finally arrived. The jury had reached a verdict. As the decision was read aloud, years of speculation gave way to legal certainty. Paul Flores was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Kristin Smart. The verdict marked a historic turning point in one of California's most infamous cold cases. For the first time since Kristin vanished in 1996, a jury had officially determined criminal responsibility for her death. But the jury's decision did not end there. In a separate verdict, Ruben Flores was found not guilty of the accessory charge against him. The split outcome reflected the jury's conclusions regarding the evidence presented against each defendant. For prosecutors, it was a significant victory. For the Smart family, it represented something they had pursued for more than a quarter of a century: justice. Or at least as much justice as the legal system could provide. Yet even in that moment, everyone inside the courtroom understood something important. The verdict answered one question, but it did not answer all of them. Because while the jury had determined who was responsible for Kristin's death, one mystery remained painfully unresolved. Where is Kristin Smart? Months later, on March 10, 2023, Paul Flores returned to court for sentencing. The judge imposed a sentence of 25 years to life in prison. The punishment ensured that Flores would spend decades behind bars and potentially the remainder of his life in custody. For many observers, the sentence represented accountability after years of delay. For Kristin's family, however, no prison sentence could fully erase 26 years of loss. No legal proceeding could restore birthdays missed, holidays left empty, family milestones celebrated without Kristin present. Justice had arrived, but closure remained complicated. Throughout the investigation, the Smart family became known for their perseverance. When public attention faded, they continued speaking. When leads disappeared, they continued searching. When years passed without answers, they refused to stop asking questions. Their determination became one of the defining elements of the case itself. In many ways, their persistence helped ensure that Kristin was never forgotten. Following the conviction and sentencing, family members expressed gratitude to investigators, prosecutors, supporters, journalists, and countless individuals who helped keep the case alive. Yet their public statements often returned to the same heartbreaking reality. Kristin still had not been found. For families of homicide victims, recovering a loved one can carry enormous emotional significance. It provides certainty, a place to visit, a place to remember, a place to grieve. For the Smart family, that chapter remains unwritten, and until Kristin is found, part of the story remains unfinished. Even till today, investigators continue pursuing information that could lead to the recovery of her remains. Authorities have repeatedly encouraged anyone with relevant knowledge to come forward, because while a conviction has been secured, the search for answers continues. Looking back, it is remarkable how close this case came to remaining unsolved forever. For years, it appeared destined to become another file buried deep within a cold case archive. Instead, a combination of persistence, advancing investigative techniques, renewed public attention, and dedicated law enforcement efforts brought the case back to life. It serves as a powerful reminder that time does not necessarily erase responsibility, and that some investigations continue long after many people believe hope is gone. But beyond the courtroom, beyond the headlines, and beyond the legal arguments, there is another lesson worth remembering. Kristin Smart was not a case. She was a person, a daughter who never returned home, a young woman with plans for the future, a student excited about the opportunities ahead of her. When true crime stories become widely known, it can be easy to focus exclusively on suspects, evidence, and trials. Yet at the center of every case is a human life, a life that mattered, a life that left a lasting impact on the people who loved them. There are also important lessons that emerge from this tragedy. Friends looking out for one another can make a profound difference. Situational awareness matters. Recognizing vulnerability, whether involving intoxication, isolation, or unfamiliar circumstances, can help reduce risk. Communities that remain engaged and willing to speak up can assist investigations in meaningful ways. And perhaps most importantly, families searching for answers should never be underestimated, because the Smart family demonstrated something extraordinary. They refused to allow time to silence their daughter's story. They refused to let her disappear from public memory. And after more than 26 years, that determination helped bring a measure of justice. Still, one final question remains. A question that has echoed through this case since Memorial Day weekend of 1996. A question that continues to haunt investigators, the Smart family, and countless people who followed the story. Where is Kristin Smart? Until that answer is found, the story is not completely over. But one thing is certain, Kristin Smart has not been forgotten. And as long as her story is remembered, the search for the final truth continues. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, consider dropping a like, comment your location in the comment box. We will be sure to read every comment. Also subscribing and turn on the notification bell for more carefully researched true crime stories focused on facts, accountability, and the pursuit of justice. And as always, stay aware, stay informed, and look out for one another.